to be introducing tonight's fantastic speaker, Emily Yates. And I went on Emily's website and found some absolutely incredible quotes about her. So I'm just going to embarrass her by reading a couple out because I just think they sum up what she's doing brilliantly. So Mary Silver says, Emily is the dream collaborator. She is a gifted storyteller and a brilliant facilitator who challenges audience to think deeply about accessibility and belonging. And Lord Sebastian Coe said, in my closing speech at the Paralympic Games in London, I talked about Emily. The Games, she said, had lifted the cloud of limitation for people with disability. So Emily is a wheelchair user, accessibility consultant and pink hair enthusiast based in Glasgow, Scotland, but clearly is in Yorkshire today at her grandparents' house. So her career highlights include leading the accessibility and inclusive design programme for MetroRio, the underground transport system for Rio de Janeiro in the run-up to the 2016 Olympic and Paralympic Games, leading the accessibility programme for COP28 in Dubai, working as the accessibility consultant for the National Railway Museum's Vision 2025 Masterplan, and being named as one of the 100 most influential disabled people in the UK for 2 consecutive years by the Shaw Trust. So I know I am so excited and delighted to hear what Emily has to tell us and can teach us about accessibility and inclusivity. So if you can all give me a virtual round of applause, I'd like to welcome Emily. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was so kind and such a lovely introduction. I really, really do appreciate it. I am going to do my very best now to just share my screen and I hope that everything goes well.
Yeah, all looking good to me.
That's worked.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And hi, good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. And thank you so much for joining us on such a beautiful evening. I feel very privileged that we've got a good amount of people in the room. So thank you. Much appreciated. After that very lovely introduction, just a very quick introduction to myself. Oh, nice. Oh yeah, they are working. Brilliant. So hi, my name's Emily Yates, and as Becky mentioned, I'm a wheelchair user, a very proud Yorkshire girl, as you can probably tell from my accent, and I have been working in the accessibility and inclusive design space for just over 12 years now. I'm currently the head of accessibility and inclusive design at a design agency called Mima that's based in London. And I'm very lucky to work on projects surrounding physical, digital and social accessibility all over the world, some of which I will be telling you about today. My plan for today, if it's okay with everybody, is to really split my talk into 4 different areas. I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and my personal experiences as a disabled person to really set the scene. Then I would like to talk to you a little bit about some disability theories and models that I really think help everybody to find a bit of a grounding when it comes to accessibility and inclusive design. Some of them you might be aware of, some of them you might not, but we'll spend a little bit of time going through a few of those. Then I've got some specific case studies of projects that I've worked on, some that Becky has already mentioned, that I'd like to tell you a bit more about how accessibility and inclusive design was an important component of those projects. And then finally, I would like to share with you some hints and tips that hopefully you can take forward into your work, into your studies, whatever you're doing, to help you think a little bit more broadly when it comes to how to create an inclusive or accessible project. So I hope that sounds okay to everybody. And without further ado, I would like to tell you a little bit about myself and my own personal experiences as a disabled person. So I grew up in Skipton, North Yorkshire, not very far from where I am right now in my grandparents' office, which is quite a nice full circle moment. And I was born with cerebral palsy, which streamlining it very much means that I had a lack of oxygen as I was being born, and therefore the messages that go from my brain to my legs get all muddled up, and I'm a wheelchair user and I'm unable to walk. That disability was heightened slightly after a failed operation when I was 9 years old. So I've been a wheelchair user ever since. I'm 32 now, so have been in a wheelchair much longer than I was without one. And very strangely, although of course there are many instances where inaccessibility is a real problem, negative attitudes are a real problem, I do have to say that it's been a hugely positive part of my life to be a wheelchair user, and a hugely proud part of my identity now. I went to a mainstream school and was very lucky to have good groups of friends. I didn't really experience any bullying or anything like that. But my life as a disabled person really took off, I think, when I was 16. I was nominated by my school to spend a summer with 24 other complete and utter strangers in Southern Africa with a charity called JOLT, the Journey of a Lifetime Trust. And JOLT takes people who are disabled or disadvantaged in some way to far-flung, exotic locations on a literal journey of a lifetime, with the aim of helping them realise their capabilities rather than their limitations. And that's certainly what JOLT did for me. I have never been more aware of the fact that I'm a wheelchair user, of the fact that society and certain terrains are particularly difficult, but I've also never been more aware of my strengths as a disabled traveller than when I went on JOLT when I was 16 years old in the summer of 2008. We went to Namibia, Lesotho, and South Africa. And as I mentioned earlier, I was with 24 other complete and utter strangers, some of whom had physical disabilities like mine, some of whom had sensory impairments, who might have been blind or deaf, for example, and others who'd had really difficult upbringings, a lot of emotional turmoil in their lives, for example. And I want to show you this image on screen. For anyone that requires audio description, the image on the screen right now is of a tall, bright red sand dune in the Namibian desert. There is a blue, cloudless sky behind it, and one singular tree that has definitely been blown around by the desert weather and is looking quite dry, but still beautiful nonetheless. And this was the third day of our trip. We hadn't really got to know each other at this point. We were still all quite nervous and still just kind of finding our way. And our task for the day was to get to the top of this sand dune in any which way possible. We weren't given a time limit. We were just told that everybody needed to get to the top and lay with their bellies flat at the top of the sand dune. There was, as I'm sure you can imagine, lots of shouting, crawling, shuffling, lots of guiding people who were visually impaired up the sand. I was crawling up myself, and the sand was incredibly hot, so much that I had to just move quickly to not burn myself too much. And eventually we all got up to the top of that sand dune, and the subconscious collaboration and community that was created by that task alone will stay with me forever. And it's something that I've definitely taken into my work within the design space when I now recruit and facilitate lived experience user groups, for example. And I just wanted to share that as one really impactful thing that happened to me as a disabled person. 2 years after that, I was again very fortunate to be nominated to go on a trip, this time with the Yorkshire Schools Exploring Society. And this was quite a different trip in the sense that the Yorkshire Schools Exploring Society had been going for 30 years at the time, but had never taken a disabled person with them. It was a much smaller group. There were only about 10 of us that went on the trip, but I was, in effect, a real life guinea pig. They'd never ever taken anybody with any kind of impairment or access requirement before. This trip was equally amazing. We were to cross the Sinai Desert only via camel, and then to learn how to scuba dive in the Red Sea off the coast of Dahab. Again, a life-changing event that I definitely won't forget in a hurry. Sleeping under the stars in the Sinai Desert was incredible. But there was one real distinct difference in this trip, and it was the fact that I was the only disabled person there. I had to learn very quickly how to adapt to almost stay in line with my non-disabled peers and how to keep up, for lack of a better term. I remember after the scuba diving experiences, I used to go back to the hotel every night and cry, not from sadness, but just from exhaustion. But I used to get up the next morning and try again and try and keep up. And I managed to get my PADI certification, which was great. But this trip, in opposition to Jolt, really made me realise my limitations as a disabled person. It was quite a sobering trip. I realised that I was never going to be without a few barriers, without a few challenges, and without needing to ask for help every now and again. And those things aren't necessarily bad things, but it's important to realise them and be comfortable with them and be accepting of them. And that's what this Sinai trip did for me in the summer of 2010. I failed to mention that when I applied for this trip, the female leader very quickly withdrew her own application. So I had two options. Either I withdrew my application as well, or my mum came with me. And as an 18-year-old, I was very worried about my street cred at the time and worried how having my mum would change the dynamic of the trip, as it were. But we discussed it one night and she ended up coming on the trip with me. And it was one of the most incredible bonding experiences that I feel so privileged to have had with my mum, and something we still talk about now. Fast forward another 2 years. I was fortunate enough to go and study at the University of Melbourne for a year, for a sandwich year of my degree. I was studying at Queen Mary University in East London, which was a brilliant experience. And of course, at that age, Australia was the furthest that I'd ever been away from home. It was the only time I'd ever travelled independently. I got on that plane totally on my own and didn't really know where I was going or what I was doing, but something inside me just knew that it was important that I got the courage to go, and I took the trip, and I knew that it would really change how I see my capabilities, my autonomy, my independence as a disabled person. And when I arrived at the University of Melbourne, it has a similar collegiate system to Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, in the sense that people stay in a college together, they eat together. It's a very kind of intimate experience, really. And there were 300 people in our college and one other wheelchair user. There's two images on the screen right now, and there's a picture of me to the right-hand side with my pink hair and a floral top. And next to me, a girl with dark brown ringlets who's also sat in a wheelchair in a blue dress. And this is Alex. Alex was the only other wheelchair user in the college at the time. And when we started talking and I started introducing myself, Alex didn't really want to know me or to become friends with me, and she wasn't particularly interested in what I had to say. And I'll be honest, I was a little bit offended and I didn't really understand why. And one weekend, her parents came over to visit her and they knocked on my door and they explained that Alex had never really been around disabled people before. She'd never had disabled people as part of her friendship group. And she really was worried that in having another disabled friend, it would almost heighten her disability label, if you like. And she wanted to push against that. She didn't want to be seen as the wheelchair user, which I, of course, totally understood. But I persisted, I kept trying, and eventually, over a night talking about music and my travels, she really, really wanted an experience similar to the ones that I'd had. She'd never been out of Australia before, and the trips that she had taken were with her family, which she'd thoroughly enjoyed, but had not quite given her that same kind of confidence and satisfaction. So that night, we agreed to take a trip to Sydney together. Only a 90-minute flight, not too far, not too stressful. But the idea of not having anybody to carry our bags for us or immediately help us out or come and grab a vehicle for us if we needed it was quite, again, a sobering thought, but a really exciting one nonetheless. And a few months later, we took the flight to Sydney, had the most incredible time. Dare I say it, kissed a few boys in youth hostels, which was very good, and just had such a brilliant experience. And to be able to see that confidence grow in her and that understanding that actually, yes, things are difficult, but it doesn't mean they're impossible was really, really beautiful. And this is a completely true story. After I'd come back from Australia and I was spending Christmas with my family in North Yorkshire, there was a knock on the door, and Alex had travelled all the way from Melbourne to my little hometown in North Yorkshire on her own to spend Christmas with me and my family. And I truly don't think that without that little trip to Sydney, she'd have been able to do that. And it still chokes me up every time I tell the story, because to know that you've instilled that confidence in somebody is a really wonderful feeling and something that definitely inspired my career today. And then the final slide about my personal experiences before we get on to some more kind of theory and hints and tips was my experience at Rio 2016. I was very fortunate that once I came back from Australia, finished my final year of uni at Queen Mary, I had applied to be a games maker at the London 2012 Paralympic Games and was successful in that application. And I got a call when I was going down on the train to my first shift to ask me if the following morning I'd be happy to take part in a media conference to just explain what it was like to be a disabled volunteer, speaking with all of these disabled athletes and whether attitudes had changed in London at the time. And I gave this press conference and I said that I felt the Games had really lifted the cloud of limitation for disabled people in the fact that there just seemed to be more opportunity and excitement around disability all of a sudden. The awareness of disability and empathy around disability had just really heightened, or that's definitely how I felt. And Lord Sebastian Coe then quoted me in his closing ceremony speech. Just after that, I was contacted by the British consulate to ask me to go to Rio to give a bit of a speech about my life, some of the things that I'd done, some of the travels that I'd had, and to advise NGOs and other organisations how to be that little bit more accessible and inclusive for disabled people, whether locals, athletes, or visitors. I was giving a presentation not dissimilar to this, and at the end of it, somebody in the audience stood up and said that they worked for the underground transport system in Rio and offered me to go to their offices the next day for an interview because they were in desperate need of an accessibility consultant. Bearing in mind, I'd done very little access consultancy at this point. But nevertheless, I went for an interview and I was fortunate to get the role. And I spent the next 2 years on and off in living in and around Rio and spending pretty much all of my days in their 35 underground stations, speaking to disabled people, doing audits and risk assessments, and just advising on how they could update their facilities and features to get ready for the 2016 Olympic and Paralympic Games. I was then contacted by Lonely Planet via a Twitter exchange. So this is the power of social media. Just after I'd got back from working with MetroRio, Lonely Planet were interested in writing an accessible guide for Paralympians and for anybody going over to watch the Games in Rio, and asked me to go back out to Rio and to author that guide, which was an incredible experience. And after that, I came back home and I've had a wonderful few years really building up my access consultancy knowledge on a national and international scale and really continuing the work that was started for MetroRio. So that's enough about me and my personal experiences, and hopefully gives you a little bit of a grounding on what I'm about and some of the experiences that I've had that have led to what I'm doing now. But I wanted to share with you some models and theories that surround disability in particular that I hope will really help your thinking when it comes to accessible and inclusive design. And the thing that's really great about these models and theories is it doesn't matter what your work is in, what sector you work in, whether you're studying, whether you've got years of experience, they really are applicable to everything and everyone. So the first model that I would like to start with, and I've got a video to show you that I hope works. It did work when Becky and I tested it, is the social model of disability. And some of you may be aware that up until only about 40 years ago, society ran on something called the medical model of disability, which basically said, if you are disabled, if you have an impairment, something that quote unquote is wrong with your body, that is your problem and not something that we as a society need to adapt or cater for. So my parents are in their late 50s and early 60s, and they quite often say to me, well, you were the first disabled person that we really met, Emily, because the disabled people that were our peers didn't go to our schools. We didn't see them out on public transport. We didn't see them in the nightclubs that we went to. Why? Because society wasn't accessible. The built environment wasn't accessible, and therefore it was very difficult to get anywhere. So that's the medical model of disability. And as I say, about 40 years ago now, some brilliant disability scholars got together and said, hang on a minute, this isn't quite right. This shouldn't be the way that things go. And they created the social model of disability, which basically says, yes, we have internal impairments as disabled people, but actually we're probably more disabled by society's physical barriers, attitudes, and issues than we are by our bodies. And don't we all therefore have a responsibility to try and remove some of these barriers, to therefore lessen the disability that some people experience? I'm very proud of my identity as a disabled person, but I cannot stress enough how much physical barriers and negative attitudes only heighten my experience of disability. So that's a really important thing to think about when we think about all of our individual responsibilities and the differences we can make when it comes to accessible and inclusive design. And hopefully, if this works, fingers crossed,
I always felt being a disabled person was a problem. After learning about social model, it challenged me to look at disability completely differently. I myself was able to gain some confidence and self-esteem.
Social model basically says we are people with impairments, and those impairments clearly have an impact on how we live our lives. But the impairments are not the things which disable us.
I'm disabled by the world around me, and if the world was more accessible, I would be less disabled, and then I would just be left with my impairment, i.e. what doesn't work. It's not that my legs don't work that's disabling me, it's the fact that if I want to, if I'm on a flat surface, I can wheel around fine, I'm wonderfully happy. It's only when I come up to a flight of stairs.
As a wheelchair user, you have a slightly easier job of explaining the social model. Whereas if you're trying to explain the less physical barriers, it's much harder.
There's barriers everywhere in life to do with how we communicate, to do with people's attitudes.
Discovering the social model actually was a massive liberation on another level. Yeah, I was being treated differently, and no, it wasn't me being deficient, it was everybody else's social anxieties that were being projected onto me.
The blame for you not fitting in is no longer on your shoulders.
Suddenly, my disability is out there and not in here. It was what made me realise that I was something beyond the thing that other people thought I was.
It's a real liberating thing, but it also means you can change it. We can say to the world, look, you must put a lift in this building. You must make sure that the signage is readable for people with visual impairments.
If you want that equality to be real, you've really got to then tackle the inequality people are experiencing in schools, in workplaces, with transport.
The main reason that the social model I think is important to disabled people is that it allows us to be a community. You achieve a whole lot more as a group.
As long as we as disabled people make sure that our voices are heard and that all those people that support us also have their voices heard, I think we will get there.
I hope that Scope is doing work that will help disabled people to become prouder of who we are, pushing boundaries around who can be included and where.
Come the glorious day, if it ever came, where all the barriers went, you know, we'd just be people with impairments. We wouldn't be disabled people anymore.
Find out more about Scope's work.
Okay, one thing that I really love about the social model is, yes, it allows us as disabled people to become a community and fight the good fight, but it also allows non-disabled people to become our allies, to have a slice of that responsibility. And I hope that that resonates a little bit in whatever work you are doing at the moment. So moving on to another model, if you like, the purple pound, which I'm sure some of you will have heard of. Very simply put, the purple pound is the spending power of disabled people and their households. It's no secret that disabled people are loyal customers. If we go to a place that's accessible, we'll come back again and again. We'll tell all our friends and family about it. And yes, contrary to popular belief, we do have money to spend, and we want to spend it in the right places that cater for us properly. The purple pound is currently worth, I think it might even be slightly more than this now, because this infographic is a couple of years old, but it's worth an estimated £274 billion per year to UK businesses alone. So if a business is inaccessible, either physically or digitally, or actually operationally, with the attitudes of staff members that it employs, for example, they're missing out on a part of that purple pound pie. Just to give you one example, it's estimated that transport providers are missing out on £42 million a month due to inaccessibility. So this is particularly for the people on the virtual call who might be designers, who might be architects, for example. If you are working with a client and you're having to put a bit of a business case forward for a particular inclusive design solution, the purple pound is your friend when it comes to that business case. And again, I hope that's really helpful in just solidifying some of that thinking. The spoon theory is a slightly lesser known theory, but one of my favourites, and one that really made a difference to me when I first heard about it. And this comes from a completely true story by a woman called Christine Miserando. Now, Christine has lupus, which is a chronic fatigue condition, and she was out with a friend at a cafe, and the friend just asked her to explain a little bit more about what her impairment was and what her daily access requirements were, and she couldn't really find the words to explain it. There were 12 spoons in a pot on the cafe table, and Christine picked them up and said to a friend, "Imagine just for a second that these spoons are your units of energy. They're finite. When the day runs out, or when your energy runs out, when your spoons run out, you won't get any more. It also costs you more spoons, more units of energy to do what we usually class as very simple tasks. So for me, it takes me a spoon or a unit of energy to get out of bed in the morning, another 2 to have a shower, and maybe another 1 to get dressed. So out of the 12, by the time I'm even ready for work, I've lost a third of my energy for the day. It then might cost me 4 spoons to go to work. So then when I get home and I've got 4 left, I've really got to decide, do I want to make a fancy meal for myself? Do I want to tidy my apartment? Do I want to go out with my friends? Because simply put, I cannot do both. When I'm poorly, when I'm ill, all of these things are going to cost more units of energy and more spoons. And again, as I said earlier, it's a finite resource. So when they're done, you don't get any more. And again, for those of you who work in the design space, regardless of what elements you might focus on, I think the spoon theory is one of the most powerful models to really start thinking about. If you are thinking about distances, for example, making sure that inclusively designed seating is available for older people, for disabled people, for those with non-visible impairments who might be members almost of that spoon theory gang. That's absolutely vital. If you're designing a website, how many click-throughs is somebody going to need to take before they can get to the information on accessibility? Is there even any information on accessibility on the website? Or is somebody going to waste 30 minutes of their time and a couple of spoons trying to find some? You see where I'm going with this. And so often we focus on wheelchair users like myself, and we focus on visible impairments and what we can do to design step-free and barrier-free access, which of course is absolutely vital, but so is this. So is thinking about non-visible impairments and access requirements as well. Some of you may be aware of the brilliant inclusive design toolkit from Microsoft, and this is just one of the tools that they utilize to help people think about how they can reframe the concept of disability. So on the screen here is a table of permanent, temporary, and situational impairments that are categorized by the senses of touch, see, hear, and speak. And there are different elements of impairment based on each of the senses. So I'll take you through one example right now. For the graph around here, the permanent impairment is deafness. The temporary impairment is to have an ear infection, and the situational impairment is to be a bartender. That probably sounds a bit bizarre, but let me explain. The whole point of this particular tool is to really understand and appreciate that disability and the access needs that relate to disability are so much broader than the general impairments, quote unquote, that we often think about. So yes, we have wheelchair users, we have people who are blind or partially sighted. In this scenario, we have somebody with a permanent impairment who might be profoundly deaf and utilize British Sign Language. Absolutely great. That person might need captioned videos. They might need somebody to give them good eye contact and gesture when they're giving them instructions. They might, in a conference environment, require a hearing loop or to sit at a certain point within the audience so that there are good sight lines. All of these things would help those people. But actually, somebody with a temporary ear infection might also benefit from all of those things, even if they don't utilize British Sign Language, and even if their hearing might restore itself in the next couple of months, i.e. the design solutions that we can implement for those with permanent impairments can also benefit those with temporary and situational impairments. I want those of you in London in particular to think about the noisiest nightclub you've ever been in and how difficult it is to shout and ask for a drink, and what a hard time that bartender must have hearing you. How beneficial would it be for that bartender to have some kind of visual cue to help them understand exactly what you want? i.e., even though that bartender isn't disabled and doesn't have an impairment, they do have a situational impairment based on the current environment that they're in and might still benefit from certain design solutions. So can we see here that when we design accessibly, when we put certain solutions in place, those things, if done correctly, can create a bit of a ripple effect and also benefit those with temporary and situational impairments. I really do encourage you to have a look at the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit. It really is a great resource. One of the final models that I would just like to quickly show you, it's not even really a model, it's just talking about the important issue of equality versus equity. Up until very recently, equality was the big buzzword, wasn't it? And very rightly so. This idea of people having equal opportunities, people being on a level playing field with each other. But soon it was realised that actually giving people the same resources and the same opportunities doesn't necessarily mean that they are on an equal playing field to each other. Why? Because people might start with very different abilities, very different resources, and very different impairments. So what's really needed a lot of the time to allow people to have the same opportunities and to reach similar potentials is something called equity. Really working out what people do or don't start with and have as a resource and an ability, and figuring out what you need to provide to make sure that those people can reach their potential. So here we've got an example on the screen of equality being providing both a very small child, an older child, and a fully grown adult with one box to stand on to get over a gate to see a baseball match being played. Of course, the man, the fully grown man, can see over the fence very, very easily, but the young child, the youngest infant, can't even get his head over the fence. Equity, however, would be perhaps not giving the fully grown man a box to stand on, giving the middle child one box to stand on, and the infant two boxes to stand on, therefore allowing them all equally to be able to see over the fence. We're aware of the lack of resources at that particular moment and in that particular situation that the infant had, and actually how much more privilege or how many more resources this fully grown man had for this particular situation. It might change again in another dynamic, but for now, that creates equity. So if you can have a little look in the things that you're designing and think about the resources or lack of that certain participants, certain customers, certain visitors or guests might have, that might really be able to help you create a more inclusive design solution. I also just wanted to quickly show you, let me just get this totally right. I also just wanted to quickly show you something that we put together. This was actually for our COP28 proposal. When we were bidding for that work that we were then fortunate enough to win. We wanted to really show that accessible and inclusive design doesn't just focus on those with very visible mobility impairments, and it doesn't just focus on disability. There are other protected characteristics surrounding age, surrounding gender, surrounding pregnancy and maternity, race, religion, and belief that all incorporate themselves into the need for inclusive design. So we've got an image on the screen of a total of 10 different characters, and they're all facing the same way and walking or wheeling in a certain direction. And we've just picked out a few of these characters and given them a bit of a name and a personality, and just thought about what they might need from certain venues or from certain environments. So Dave, for example, has a white cane, he's visually impaired, and he needs to know if the website is accessible for screen reader users so he can learn about the venue before coming to visit. Saeed, however, would like a prayer room at the venue so he can meditate when he wishes. Sarah, who's a wheelchair user, needs to know if the venue has a wheelchair accessible bathroom and if all the activities on site can be used by ambulant disabled people. That means that Sarah is able to transfer in and out of her wheelchair and maybe take a few steps. Not everybody will be able to. Lara needs to know if the venue has a gender-neutral toilet, as they do not identify as female or male, nor feel comfortable using those toilets. Marsha is pregnant and needs an accessible and private place to nurse her child. And Tom needs to know if the venue is dog-friendly. His dog Mike is important for his journey as he gives him confidence and helps reduce his anxiety. And Kimberly is neurodivergent, she has ADHD, and wants to know if the venue subscribes to the Hidden Disabilities Sunflower Scheme. So we can see here, just from this one slide alone, how much thought needs to go into accessible and inclusive design that extends beyond wheelchair users and those with physical mobility impairments. So again, just hopefully a few seeds to get you thinking a little bit wider if that's something that you would like to do. I'd like to now move on to just tell you about 3 case studies of projects that I've been personally involved in at Mima. And I'm more than happy to take further questions about these when we get to a bit of a Q&A session later on. So the first of 3 projects that I'd like to talk to you about is the fact that I'm the accessibility consultant for the Vision 2025 programme at the National Railway Museum in York. Now, there are 6 different schemes within this Vision 2025 master plan, and of course I can't talk about all of them. But one that I do want to talk about is the recently opened Wonderlab, which is an engineering playground for 7 to 14-year-olds. And I want to specifically talk about the importance of representation and collaboration for this project. So we've got 4 images on the screen here. 2 to the left-hand side are visuals for a central hall, an iconic central hall that's going to be built at the National Railway Museum. And the 2 images to the right-hand side are of the newly opened Wonderlab, which I have been consulting on in terms of accessibility. And there's 2 things that I want to talk to you about that really stood out with this programme. The whole point of Wonderlab is it's supposed to really encourage collaboration and exploration, experimentation, and just the idea of taking your time, having fun, and working things out. Things that aren't always possible or accessible to disabled people. So I was on a real mission with this to make sure that this was going to be an engineering playground that everybody could really get their teeth stuck into and really enjoy. There was one thing that we did that I feel made a huge difference, and that was engage with the local community. In particular, we engaged with a local disability charity called the Snappy Trust, which caters for disabled children and disabled young adults who primarily have learning difficulties or are neurodivergent. And we went over to the Snappy Trust a couple of times and took different prototypes of different exhibits with us. There are now 25 different exhibits in Wonderlab. So we were only able to show members of the Snappy Trust 3 different examples, but just seeing their reactions and how they interacted with certain exhibits, how easy or difficult it was to turn certain levers or pull pulleys, or how difficult or easy it was to understand why a particular scarf had to go in this hole in an exhibit in order to learn something. They were all really, really valuable lessons for us. And we were able to work out how much we needed to simplify or complicate or explain certain areas, and how easy or difficult it would be for seated, standing, visually impaired, autistic users to really be able to interact and engage with the exhibit and get the full potential out of it. From that experience, one thing that we did, and again, it's such a simple thing, but I really think it's made the world of difference, is we wanted collaboration to be absolutely key to Wonderlab. We wanted children that were total strangers to be able to work together and figure something out and learn something. And I was very conscious that with 25 different exhibits that all looked and moved very differently and all had different learning objectives, that it might be quite overwhelming for somebody to just be able to go up to something and learn how it worked or work out exactly what they needed to do to make something move. And the one thing that we did was we made sure that any actionable element on any of those 25 exhibits was of the same colour. That's all we did, of course, a lot of other things as well. But in terms of that, that was the only rule that we applied. Most of the exhibits were of a grey, usually a dark grey colour, and we made sure that all the actionable elements were bright yellow. So whether it was a button, a lever, a pulley, a wheel, whatever it may be, now all of those actionable elements are bright yellow in the Wonderlab. And I think that has made all the difference in creating an inclusive design solution that encourages people to go and play because they know what they're looking out for and they know that they can just touch things freely and they're not going to be worried about breaking something. But those actionable elements that are all in the same colour really allow somebody to start to understand the correlation between action, movement, and solution or outcome in a way that I don't think they would have been able to had that colour scheme not been implemented. So we did it originally to enable visually impaired users to easily see contrast, to allow those with learning difficulties to understand that actually it's okay to touch this element, for example. But I think what we've done in a mass way is really help everybody that goes to WonderLab understand that action to movement to outcome phenomenon and process. And that's something that I'm really pleased that something that came out of an inclusive design conversation has really helped everybody. And that's what I think we should be aiming for in most instances. And again, I'm happy to talk about that a little bit later on when we get to Q&A. I also wanted to tell you about one specific example of our work at COP28 in Dubai. So, of course, a major global event, lots of temporary as well as permanent structures, and really an event that has the world's eyes on it for lots of different reasons, but increasingly so because of accessibility as well. And one thing that really came up for us at COP was how we worked to make sure that accessibility and sustainability meshed together and worked well together. And that might sound like quite a simple thing to do, but it really, really isn't. And one thing that I'm quite interested in the future is how accessibility and sustainability as two areas that are really coming up and gaining interest and traction for brilliant reasons actually end up working together instead of going apart from each other. I think we've got quite a lot of work to do in that area personally. And just to tell you one specific example, on the screen right now, there's 3 different images. 2 of them towards the right focus on the COP28 UAE logo. And to the left-hand side of the screen, there's a wheelchair user in a high-vis jacket next to a lectern on a stage with a few other members of staff near her. That is the brilliant Fatma Al-Jazim, who is a phenomenal accessibility consultant based in Dubai. And Fatma, I hope she won't mind me saying, in recent times has not been able to eat in the conventional way. She has to be fed through a tube. And we were talking a lot about accessibility and sustainability, and the COP client were telling us about the different processes and policies they wanted to put in place. And one of those, again, it sounds so simple, but makes such an impact, was that they wanted to ban any kind of single-use plastic or other materials, one of those being straws. Understandable, of course, an event focused on sustainability. And Fatma very clearly and very rightly said, but hang on a minute, I can't utilise a plastic, I can't, I sometimes need a single-use plastic straw because I'm unable to drink unless I have a straw with me. So by banning single-use plastics and by banning certain straws, you will in effect be stopping some disabled people from being able to drink at this event, or at least being able to purchase their own drink that they can access. And the client understandably said, wow, we've not even really thought about that. How are we going to get around this? Because we want to have some kind of rule and regulation around sustainability, but we of course want to be accessible as an event. And we then put in a policy the simplest 3 or 4 lines paragraph that basically said, whilst COP28 as an event is doing everything possible to reduce the use of single-use materials, we will have straws available for those wishing to use them. Please just ask if that's something that you need to do. And this idea of eco-ableism being present, i.e. sustainability measures not really considering accessibility measures, was made so clear to me by Fatma's very simple but very profound point, and it is something that will stay with me for a very long time. Just think operationally about all the processes and policies that you've got in place in any of the projects that you're working on, and just sit and think for a second, is that going to serve and cater for disabled people or those with other protected characteristics? And if not, what do we need to do about it to still uphold the values and the mission and the vision of the client that we're working for, but making sure that everybody can be included. And finally, I wanted to share with you some work that we did with HS2, specifically looking at signage and wayfinding strategies for their Old Oak Common station. I was not involved very much in the wayfinding design of this, although it was brilliant and it was done by my excellent colleagues, Darren and Adam and Kira and Rosie as part of the wayfinding team at Mima. But I was involved in the lived experience user testing part of this. This project won an award for us surrounding innovation. And what we did that we're really proud of is we prototyped some different signage and wayfinding elements that we thought would work quite well in a station environment that at the time, of course, hadn't been built yet. And we wanted to test how our thoughts of what might work might feel and look like in reality. And we wanted to make sure that this testing didn't just involve non-disabled people or people that were aware of design, but we wanted to also involve people with lived experience of different disabilities and general members of the public, because let's face it, we need to make sure that everybody can get around and find their way around a certain environment. I'm really, really pleased that we were able to recruit 8 different users with lived experience of different impairments, those who were wheelchair users and power chair users, those who were visually impaired, those who were deaf, those who had mobility impairments but were ambulant, those who were neurodivergent in some way, all had an opportunity to have a little look and play with this potential design through the use of virtual reality. One thing that was great for us internally was that with each and every individual with lived experience that sat down with us, we had to, on the spot, plan how to work out how they were going to be able to utilize the technology in front of them. Somebody with a visual impairment needed different contrast levels. When they put the headset on, we had to work out whether they could utilize their glasses in quite a good way whilst wearing the headset. Another person wasn't able to use their fingers in a way, they had limited dexterity, so we had to very quickly work out a way that they could use a controller. We actually moved it horizontally instead of vertically so they could use it as more of a gaming controller, and that worked really well. So internally it was a brilliant project for us in terms of thinking on our feet, coming up with inclusive solutions on the spot to make sure that this trial was able to go ahead. But in terms of the insights that we got from people when it came to the need for certain contrast, whether zone colours made sense and enabled somebody to make a full journey down to a train, where somebody might require staff availability, where signage for vertical circulation points such as lifts were most useful, how somebody would follow an accessible route out to a taxi rank or a bus stop, were all fascinating insights that we got that I don't think we'd have got in the same way if we hadn't have included those with lived experience of disabilities. And again, I'm happy to discuss this further. And Becky, for future talks, I think the wayfinding team would absolutely love to come and chat to you about the specifics and the nuances of the design here that I just couldn't do justice in the same way. So to finish up, and then of course have time to chat and take questions, I just wanted to finish with one slide of general hints and tips that I would like to go through with you. Hopefully it's become pretty apparent from my chat with you that lived experience of disability, but also other protected characteristics such as age, gender, race and religion, sexual orientation, etc., should always be at the heart of accessible and inclusive design. So if ever you've got the opportunity to recruit, to facilitate lived experience user groups, please do so. It's really important to mention as well that just because I'm a wheelchair with cerebral palsy, I could be sat next to another wheelchair user with cerebral palsy and want different things. Quite often, the users in the groups that I facilitate, particularly people who are visually impaired and people that are autistic, require very different things in the built environment. Huge amounts of colour contrast and light and lots of visual interest to help navigation, versus arguably the need for more diluted, calming approaches, not over visual busyness, not overwhelming design. So even just getting different viewpoints from people with different impairments is absolutely key, and I promise it will be absolutely worth it. But at the same time as this, please don't forget the standards and guidance that are out there. I use BS 8300, the Department for Transport Inclusive Mobility document, the new PAS 6463 around design for the mind and neurodiversity, the Sign Design Guide. I use these standards and guidance all the time, and in general, they provide a brilliant baseline that engaging with lived experience will then only heighten and only bring to life and only humanize that little bit more. I also just wanted to say that representation is absolutely key. I am always more likely to visit a restaurant, a hotel, a museum, an event in which I can just see on a poster a disabled person, or I can just easily access on a website the accessibility information that's available. Making that representation very obvious is really important and makes a huge difference in design and in use afterwards. Honesty really is the best policy, and I know this sounds cliche and ridiculous, but the amount of places that I've been to that have said that they offer step and barrier-free access, but then have provided 5 or 6 steps up to the front door is honestly ridiculous, the amount of time that's happened. And I think it's because people have the best of intentions. They want to do the right thing. They want to be seen as being accessible and inclusive. But that is no good if by the time somebody gets there, that isn't the reality. So I always really recommend to anybody, designers, clients, students, just really promote this honesty around accessibility and inclusive design. There is no shame in saying we are on part of that journey, but it's better to do that than promise the world and to not be able to achieve it. Also, for the designers out there, focus internally as well as externally. There is, of course, when it comes to business and reputation, a massive focus on customers, on passengers, on visitors, and how can we make the experience more accessible for them. That is brilliant. But the next stage in this, and the part that makes it really inclusive and really changes society's perceptions, is also focusing on the staff experience. So if you're thinking of an airport, for example, not just how can we get more passengers in the door with a variety of different requirements, but how can we become a more inclusive employer that employs disabled people, employs people with different protected characteristics, and makes this a really inclusive, accessible place to work and place to be. That is the thing in my mind that will really start to change the world. Remember, there's really, although I say it all the time, no such thing as disabled and non-disabled. There's really only disabled people and not yet disabled people. And if we start thinking and understanding that whether it's through injury or hopefully just old age, pretty much every single one of us at one point in our life will experience what it's like to have some kind of impairment, some kind of access requirement. I would like to think that if we realise that, accessible design will go a little bit further forward and a little bit quicker. So I'd really like you to take that away with you if that's at all possible. And the final point that I'd like to make is, in my personal and professional opinion, aspirational pragmatism is the way forward. I am not sat here tonight as a disabled person saying everything needs to be ideal right now. Of course, that would be ideal if it was, but that's not the reality. What is the reality is we've all got a responsibility to do something and to take baby steps to start making things better now. And things aren't going to be perfect. Accessibility isn't a journey that you can kind of just tick off or a game that you can finish. It is a continuous process that you've got to enjoy doing at the same time. And if you can be both aspirational with your aims and pragmatic with what the reality is now, I think we can go a long way in terms of what design solutions we can come up with together. So that's it from me. Thank you so very much for your time. I hope that's been a useful overview of how to incorporate accessibility into design. And I'm more than happy to take any questions or chat further. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was absolutely fantastic. And there's just so much that I want to go away and tell everyone about. It's just thinking about things and the way you frame things in a very different way. Sorry, I'm gonna repin you, I think. Otherwise we'll just see everyone else. Sorry about that. So yeah, really appreciated. And I want you to know that there's a massive round of applause going on that you just can't hear it because it's virtual. So I know, yeah, it's absolutely as a friend Jeremy said, this he said your talk would be eye-opening, and it really was. And a lot of it's sort of common sense, but it's just thinking about things and just reevaluating. And yeah, there's just so much we can all do, I think. So thank you very much for being so generous with your time and sharing so much. Is there, you've mentioned so many fantastic resources, is there one place that you can go and find them all on the internet, because there's so many things like that? Or is it like, I'm happy to go and do the research myself and go and look for all those things you've mentioned, but is there a one-stop shop for a lot of the things you've mentioned?
In my personal experience, no, there is not a one-shop stop. I think there could definitely be more what we call accessibility hubs around. There are, however, some really, really great startups and small businesses, or even medium-sized businesses actually, that are doing a really great job in trying to pull accessibility information together for disabled people. So you've got businesses the likes of Accessible, Sociability, Ewan's Guide. They're all able to provide information on businesses and the accessibility of those for disabled people. When it comes to looking at accessibility and inclusive design from a different lens, through a professional lens, I would really recommend that you look at the NRAC website, the National Register of Access Consultants, and another brilliant resource, another couple of brilliant resources are DEQ University, that's DEQUE University, for anything to do with digital accessibility. If you'd like to hone your skills in that, that's something that I'm starting to learn, because that my skill set is in physical and social access. And also the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, the IAAP, provides some really brilliant resources as well, and chat boards and things like that for anyone that's having any issues.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. We will try and pull a lot of the resources together and put them on our social media channels so that anyone who's been at the talk can access them. So we have a couple of questions coming in. Lots of people saying brilliant talk, as I completely agree. T Patton or Peyton, apologies if I'm pronouncing names incorrectly here, has said, great talk, thank you. To what extent did your degree and lived experience inform your technical expertise?
Oh, that's such a good question. I also did a master's degree in disability studies after my undergraduate, which was very much based around kind of the politics and processes of disability, looking at things like media representation, the welfare state, of course, the built environment and accessibility around that. And I would say that that allowed me to really start honing in on what my interest was, and therefore building my expertise from there. I think that definitely my lived experience as a wheelchair user has allowed me to really understand barriers, and probably more importantly, humanize solutions a little bit more. And I think that's important. But I would also like to say that, in my personal opinion, you can be a brilliant access consultant and not have lived experience of disability. But it is vitally important that you understand that you don't have that lived experience and find a way of getting that angle and bringing it into all the projects that you work on. But that's just my personal experience. I hope that helps.
That's great. Thank you very much. And we've got next question from Sarah. Thank you so much for your brilliant stories and insight, Emily. My question is, what helps you find a solution when there is a clash between different needs in a space?
Oh, excellent question. Usually, in all honesty, it comes down to safety, and even in some points, preservation of life, as dramatic as that sounds. So one example that always is in the front of my mind when I get asked this question is I was working for Heathrow Airport and helping to author an inclusive design standard for the designers and contractors at the airport. And we were going through our proposed text with the accessibility advisory group at Heathrow. And one person who had a mobility impairment but wasn't visually impaired said, well, there's going to be far too much tactile paving around the campus if this goes through. And somebody else who was visually impaired said, yes, but without it, and with my particular impairment, I would be at risk of being run over without that being installed. And in that scenario, it's quite easy that then you go, okay, slight discomfort or moderate discomfort maybe for somebody who's a wheelchair user that has to navigate it versus preservation of life. Okay, that's quite an easy thing to figure out what you go with. It becomes much more nuanced and much more complicated and muddy when sometimes the requirements are very, very equal. They're just different. And what's really important there, although it's not always achievable, is trying to provide flexibility, choice, and autonomy in a design. So if you have to provide, for example, which you do legally, walls and floors that contrast with each other very well to enable navigation around a space, okay, we've got to do that, and that's going to really help somebody with a visual impairment, for example. Not everyone, but some people. How can we say that we've got to do that, but also provide a quiet area, or perhaps, again, using an airport example, a scenario where you don't have to go through duty free, where it's very visually busy and crowded and contrasting? Is there a way that you can provide a solution that gives a little bit of what each group wants to both of them? Not always possible, but something that you can try and do, and actually engaging with lived experience and hearing those very personal insights helps build that business case to do so, for sure. I hope that helps. Sorry, that was a bit of a long-winded answer.
Oh, that's fantastic. So much useful information here. This is a really practical question. Where do you find people to ask about lived experiences?
Oh, another good question. It very much depends on, in my experience, what the client wants. So we've been working, for example, with Forestry England, and we've had to engage with lived experience. Of course, we wanted to, but that was also part of the project. And they specifically wanted us to engage with people that have been to specific outdoor sites and specific forests. So suddenly your pool of people vastly decreases, and you've got to be very specific in who you target and who you speak to. I have to say that there are so many local organisations, disabled people's organisations, disability charities, who are very, very kind in, if they're not able to help you, they will signpost you to someone who is, and that has worked brilliantly for us. I also have what I call a bit of a little black book of people that I've utilised before, and they're brilliant both locally and nationally and internationally. And the brilliant thing about this work is those connections and networks just keep growing the more that you do. So it's very difficult at the start to know exactly who to talk to and where to turn. I would always advise speaking to the client, finding out what they want, getting in touch with local and national organisations, making sure, of course, that you incentivise lived experience and pay people for their valuable time and expertise, but then growing that network from there.
Brilliant, thank you very much. We've got a comment from Alison Devlin, who says, I used to work at a charity with many visually impaired people, 19% of the workforce, but also staff with other impairments and accessibility needs. There was frequently a clash between what VI staff wanted in terms of signage, lighting, and non-use of PowerPoint presentations, clashed with what deaf and neurodiverse staff required. What is your experience of balancing this?
It's another great question. What I try to do whenever I give presentations, and you'll have seen from that presentation, I should have audio described every single image, and I didn't. I was too in the flow of presenting, so that's on me, that's my bad. what I try and do wherever possible is, again, provide that flex and autonomy. So if somebody is visually impaired and very much against a PowerPoint presentation, really, if I'm audio describing it well enough and talking through what's on the screen well enough, and that's absolutely needed for somebody to be able to read text and digest it in a different way, my personal argument with that would be, well, if you're happy to maybe even look at something else on your screen or not even engage with the PowerPoint, realizing that it's important for somebody else to use, and you trust me enough to be able to explain to you what's needed to be shared, that's really on me to do a good job, rather than up to them to have to engage with a PowerPoint that they don't want to. Is a great question, Alison, and it's not easy to balance that. But that's what I would say. If it's absolutely necessary for somebody to read text on a screen to be able to understand it, that arguably is still a needed form of information. The other way you could do it is always plan slides, send them in advance so that people have got them personally in front of them, but you don't necessarily need to share something on screen. That's another way of doing things and allows people to prep and engage with what they want. But yeah, just that flexibility and choice wherever possible.
That's fantastic. We've got some amazing questions this evening. Honestly, some of the best we've had in a long time.
I hope I'm doing all right.
No, you're honestly fantastic. And if you need a break, please let us know also. I feel like we could go for ages. It's just brilliant. So we had a question from Tom. So I've just got to scroll back up as more come in. So Thomas said, thank you for the incredible talk. I'm currently writing a dissertation proposal on accessibility in editorial design. I found this incredibly useful for that. Are there any key inaccessibility issues that come to mind or theories that can be applied well to this?
Oh, I think pretty much everything that I've spoken to can be applied in terms of inaccessibility as well as accessibility. Specifically in terms of editorial design, if you're talking about print media in that sense,
I'm assuming.
I would be very, very conscious of making sure that text size is big enough, the font's accessible, but also that things aren't made too visually busy. Quite often we try and cram everything in and make it look really pretty, and actually that can just cause things to jump about off the page, become completely overwhelming and inaccessible to people. One thing that's really great, if at all possible, is to provide different formats. Again, not always possible, but if there's a way within whatever you're designing that you can provide a large print version or an easy read version that has visuals to accompany simpler text, that can be a really good way of doing something. I always like to think as well that for somebody who's profoundly deaf and utilizes BSL, more often than not, their reading age is much lower. Not for any other reason other than the grammatical structure of British Sign Language is so very different to English that it's very, very difficult to access written information in the same way. So in my opinion, really, we should be avoiding jargon, technical language as much as possible. And if you do need to utilize it, providing a glossary wherever that can be provided. They're just some immediate thoughts from my head, Tom, but I'd be more than happy to chat through it further with you if that would be beneficial.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Next question, if you're happy to carry on, is, hi Emily, thanks for such a compelling talk. Was interested to know, when conducting user testing for projects, how do you go about gathering an audience to engage with, especially with something potentially serving as new experience to people such as the VR testing for HS2?
Yeah, great question. So I would say everything that I said before in terms of how to find lived experience users to talk to absolutely applies here. But also, interestingly, for the HS2 project, it's really interesting that you've picked up on the fact that it was such a new kind of innovative thing, George, because absolutely true. And that's one thing that we did really experience. We did have people that we got in touch with who we'd either worked with before or knew were particularly interested in this kind of work. But we also used a recruitment agency that specifically focused on inclusive recruitment and reaching out to those pockets of people who you know, arguably might never get asked to do certain things. And that didn't, it was difficult. It didn't go without a hitch, don't get me wrong, but it was a really nice way for me personally and professionally to think about recruitment and engagement in a different way. Because one thing that's a very easy trap to fall into as a disabled person that has friends as well as colleagues with disabilities is you don't want to end up using all the same people all the time. You know, that's not a good and professional use of different minds, different resources. It doesn't give you a true and authentic representation all the time. So we did use an inclusive recruitment agency as part of that recruitment. And I would do so again, probably just put in a bit of a better process in place now I've done it once.
That's great, thank you. A question from Lydia. Again, a fantastic talk, so much to think about and be inspired by. Have you ever worked with clients who have been resistant to bringing lived experience and user testing into projects? And if so, how have you convinced them?
Oh, such a more great questions. These are really good, thank you. I have worked with people who are resistant to that, not because they're resistant to engaging with lived experience per se, but because they see it as a add-on, nice to have, rather than something that's kind of imperative to the success of the project. I've utilised the Purple Pound to talk about the business case and the importance of doing that. And I think also when I've spoken to clients that I'm working with and really express that, yes, I'm an accessibility consultant and technically I can talk about all these different areas. I'm also just one wheelchair user and one individual. And if you're really wanting to be aspirational and be record breaking and innovative in terms of your accessibility inclusive design, I'm afraid you're going to have to utilize more than me, because I cannot speak for everybody and I never will do that. And I think when you really start to show people that, yes, having an access consultant on the team can make a huge difference and it's something that should be applied always, but that doesn't replace engaging with lived experience. And people start realizing that really they need both. And for the amount they've spent to put a design team together, really trying to find another few grand to incentivize a few people to get together in a room every couple of months to talk through designs and challenge things really beautifully and brilliantly doesn't seem like such a big amount of money to find all of a sudden when they realize the long-term benefit of that.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, I think following on from that, GT, again, apologies if I'm saying these names wrong with my big, brilliant Dorset accent. GT has said, hello, Emily, thank you for the wonderful insights into this topic. Have you ever encountered any resistance or pushback when trying to implement accessibility measures, and how do you address that kind of situation?
Lots, lots, all the time, constantly. There is always, you know, for anybody that works as part of a design team in any kind of sector or in any kind of avenue or area, this is not just focused on accessibility. There are always budget issues. You can't quite do the brilliant aspirational plan that you had because you've got to kind of funnel things down a little bit. That is no different in terms of accessibility. I think what I try and stay true to all the time, and I've managed it so far, is that I just want to make sure that I'm going above and beyond legislation wherever possible. I don't just want to be able to tick a box for somebody and say, yeah, in terms of legalities and in terms of approved document part M, you know, you're fine. As long as I'm doing more than that, I can handle some pressure and handle some streamlining. If it gets to just looking at baselines and just ticking a box, that's when I step out and say thanks, but no thanks. And I think a really important part of this work is that you've got to have that integrity and you've got to place that importance of it right at the heart of what you do, as difficult as it can be sometimes. And it doesn't make you the most popular person, but it does mean that I can kind of go to bed at night and knowing that I'm doing the right thing. And that's what I always want to do.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your honesty with all of this. I just feel like we're all learning so much from you, and I feel like we could ask you so many more questions. I've just seen one more currently, that's again from George, who was asking questions about different things. And he said, in your case study for the Wonder Lab, you mentioned that you made all actionable elements bright yellow.
Yeah.
How did you challenge how did you tackle the challenge of people with colour blindness or other visual impairments?
Okay, so the yellow actionable elements were one part of a wider puzzle, if you like, in terms of inclusive design. So another thing that we did, although we the client understandably didn't want to install loads of tactile flooring in an exhibition space, one thing that we did do was a great compromise. We worked with a brilliant graphic design team at Lucy and Roberts Plus to come up with floor markings that allowed people to be playful in the way that they moved. So you might have little circles that encourage somebody to jump or skip, or a dotted line that encourage someone to slalom. But the great secondary effect of this was those lines also connected exhibits to each other and worked as a little bit of a navigational cue. So for somebody with, you know, a moderate visual impairment that could see some stuff, but perhaps was a bit overwhelmed by the full space, they could concentrate on a line going in front of them, and it didn't matter that they didn't skip or jump or whatever it may be, but they were able to move from one exhibit to another. When it came to the actionable elements, yes, they were bright yellow. And absolutely, of course, if somebody has a certain element of colour blindness, that might not be the greatest colour for them. But what's important there is that it will have still provided a tonal contrast with the very dark grey. So even if somebody didn't see the yellow in all of its glory, they will have noted a very big tonal contrast with the dark grey and been able to therefore note it as an actionable element.
That's brilliant, thank you. I had a personal question. I work in publishing in children's books, and we're always trying to think about how we can make our books more inclusive. And it's very much print related, and it's, you know, about text size is really important, contrast of colours. Are there any other things that we should really be thinking about in terms of that?
In terms of print?
Yeah.
Sans serif fonts always. But I'm sure everybody's aware of that, but still very important. In terms of size, I mean, as I said earlier, if you're allowed to create some large print versions, that's great. One thing I did see recently, which really impressed me, was a PhD. Okay, and the kind of very academic text is on the right-hand side of the booklet and goes through on the right-hand side of the booklet. And on every single page on the left-hand side is an easier read, simplified text version of the academic side, if you like. And one thing I really loved about that is that that's not just beneficial for people with certain impairments, but it's also beneficial for people that are really short on time, people that don't want to read a whole academic study and just want to kind of get their cliff notes, if you like. And I just loved that actually that wasn't about creating a different document and segregating and separating. It was an inclusive design solution, understanding that, let's be honest, a lot of academic publishing and PhDs and all of those things, as brilliant as they are, can be exclusive in their nature. And I thought that was just absolutely genius. So I don't know if there's the capability of anything like that in print in general, but I really loved that as a solution.
No, that's really fantastic. I'm just thinking, yeah, that would really help a lot of things when you don't have to read. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Does anyone else have any more questions if they want to put them in the chat? I think we've got a couple more minutes. But Emily, is there like one thing that you just would love everyone to take away from this talk? Is like one simple thing they could do to change the way they make the world more inclusive or accessible before we see if there are any last questions?
I mean, I'm really chuffed and honoured that you've all come here, so thank you so much. And I think that in itself is a massive step. You know, the fact that you're interested in learning more is brilliant. I think just reiterating what I said earlier, I'm one person, I'm one access consultant with a kind of one way of doing things and one different opinion, one certain opinion. And watch TED Talks, go on LinkedIn, follow disabled content creators on Instagram. Just make it part of your daily life and part of your personal algorithm, if you like. Because I think the more that we're just naturally absorbed in this kind of stuff, the more it's quote unquote normalized and humanized. And that's really all that that we're wanting. You know, disabled people, people with other protected characteristics don't want special treatment, don't want pity, don't want sympathy, just want to get about our lives like everybody else. And I think normalizing it and making it part of just the way that you see the world is a massive part of doing that.
Absolutely, thank you. That's really resonated, I think. And yeah, you know, through these talks, it's something that we've woefully neglected and are really rectifying. So we'll be looking for more speakers and things like that, as well as lots of other different aspects of design and this sort of thing. So I think we're just 2 more questions and then we will let you get back to your evening, because I know you've had a busy day. Alex has said, what's the biggest barrier in website design? The percentage of 73% was so high on the Purple Pound ref in terms of it not being accessible. Is that due to the different formats or?
Great question, Alex. And yeah, as I said earlier, digital accessibility is something that I'm slowly but surely learning, as well as my expertise is more in the built environment and kind of social and operational accessibility. From my experience with colleagues and friends that I've spoken to, there's kind of 3 main barriers based on who you talk to and what certain impairments are. Number 1, really, the actual physical ability to be able to access and navigate a website. So if you are a screen reader user, for example, and your website isn't accessible, and therefore your screen reader can't read what's on the page, it can't speak it back to you, then of course you're not going to be able to find out any information about a particular organisation, venue, whatever it may be. That in itself is a problem. Equally, things like not being able to navigate a website via keyboard only. If you can't utilize a mouse and you don't have that dexterity, not just being able to flick through a website and kind of action elements by using keyboard is a big issue. I think also, just generally speaking, and sorry as well, another big digital access issue, a lack of captioned videos. A quick win that we can all change and all do quite easily at quite low cost, but the amount of videos that I see online that just aren't captioned is a big issue for not just people that are deaf and hard of hearing, but also people who are neurodivergent and prefer to listen. Prefer to read rather than listen. I also think that for the vast majority of people, whether they are older, disabled, whatever protected characteristics they may have, the genuine difficulty in being able to find accessible information and the amount of time that wastes for people is a genuine travesty. It is horrendous in this day and age that if I want to go on a romantic weekend away with my husband, I've first got to spend 4 hours checking if hotels are accessible for wheelchair users or not. I mean, that to me is just ridiculous. And looking at the Purple Pound statistic, that's where you're losing part of your pie, you know, because who's going to go to a venue, who's going to go to a restaurant, a hotel, whatever it may be, if you don't know if you're going to be able to enjoy it, have a great equitable time when you get there. So to me, that's a big thing, that whether you're a website designer or not, even if you're just a business owner, you can start affecting change with that straight away.
Thank you. And we've just got one last one from Tom and then a comment from Karis, which I'll read out in a second. I was wondering if you know any good publications that cover accessibility.
Lots. I'm trying to think immediately of some really kind of good, easy to access ones. Christine Miserando has a great site called You Don't Look Sick, which is a really, really good resource in terms of like non-visible impairments, chronic fatigue, etc. Where else do I like to get my information from? Let me just think. One thing that I'm loving more and more, in all honesty, is that podcasts are representing deaf and disabled people and neurodivergent people a little bit more. So I've started to look at those a bit more rather than read academic or technical articles, if that makes sense. There was one that was shared yesterday by a colleague of mine. We're working with the BBC at the moment on one of their programs, and the podcast episode shared is about an autistic person that went on this specific program. I'm not sharing their name because I don't know if I'm allowed to. And hearing those kind of, again, human insights from somebody makes my technical knowledge that bit easier to share with a client. So that's what I'm trying to do a little bit more of. Really just broaden what I'm doing and how I'm ingesting information. Because my natural thing is to go on LinkedIn and read a technical article. I'm trying to do less of that, in all honesty. So sorry, that's not been great in terms of publication. One that is a publication that covers accessibility. The New Mobility magazine is really, really good. That's specifically for those with mobility impairments, but it has some great articles about everyday life, technology and innovation, sex and relationships. There's like a bit of an agony aunt section. It's just great to really start to understand the nuances of disabled life, and I would highly recommend.
That is fantastic. Thank you. And just to end, I'd just like to read out a comment from Karis Zenner, who says, "Thank you so much for sharing your experiences, Emily. As a graphic designer with hypermobility complications, I often feel that resources or expected activities aren't catered towards hidden disabilities. Your talk has been very eye-opening and affirming." And
thanks, Karis. Very kind.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for giving your time so generously for us this evening. It has been an absolutely fantastic talk, and I've learned so much, and I'm just going away and looking up so many things and just want to learn more, and I can guarantee that everyone else who's been listening has as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah,
thank you. I thoroughly appreciate it. It's been a real joy to spend time with you all. I really appreciate it. So thank you so much. Sending you all lots of love from afar, and have a great evening. Hopefully you get to get a little bit of a slick of sunshine.
And if not, it's going to be lovely for the rest of the week, so it's not a problem. But thank you very much. And hopefully we'll speak to you again soon. So thank you all very much for coming as well. And we'll hopefully see you again at a St. Bride event or workshop or something very soon. So have lovely evenings. Thank you all very much.
And thanks, Becky, for hosting. Bye.
Pleasure. Bye.